Okay, so what we're going to go over today is we're going to import into the toolbox two of the toolbox ready files that we worked on during module 5. So remember that they are in my toolbox import files folder that's right here, and that what we're going to do today is the pollutant data. So we're going to import the 2.5 file into the toolbox. So I've got my ozone file here, which is a text file, and then I've got my PM 2.5 file here, which is a spreadsheet file that you can tell from the file name extensions. So inside the toolbox, how do you do that? Let's find out. So we're going to go to the continuous or meteorological data fast track. And then once we do that, we're going to click on the data inflow button, and that's where you do all of your common imports and entry into the toolbox. And we've seen that before when we did our entry of our QC data for our ozone and our PM 2.5 data. We clicked on this button also. And before we clicked on the enter quality control data button, but this time we're going to click on the import raw data file from sampler button. So this is what you always do when you import your files into the toolbox. You use this import raw data file from sampler button. So I'm going to click on that, and that opens up this form. This form actually looks kind of different from the forms we're used to looking at in the toolbox because it's a import form instead of an entry form. So what we've been doing up to this point is we've been entering information. So for example, we had our QC sheets and we entered that information by typing it into the fields in the toolbox. Now what we're going to do is we're going to import data from an external source. And the external source in this case is our toolbox ready files. So the way this form is set up is it's step by step. And what happens when you import data into the toolbox is you move your data through a pipeline. So the first table that you move your data into is the data import table. And then after that, it goes into a secondary table called the data verification table. And in the data verification table, you do some additional flagging of your data, and you add some information to your data. And then it finally moves into its permanent home, which is the archive table. So there's 3 forms that step you through this process, and this is the first form in the series. And the way it's set up is it's step by step. So it starts with step B, goes to step C, etc., etc. So there's 2 types of buttons. There is these buttons that have a little tiny check next to them, and those are single-use buttons. So those, during a routine data import, you only want to click on once. And once you click on them, they get checked off. And the reason for that was because I was thinking, what would happen if you were going through import and you get a phone call and you're totally distracted and you forget where you are in the process? Then you could look back at your screen and see that button was checked off, so you know where to start up again. The other type of buttons are these gray buttons. And these are multi-use buttons. So the gray buttons allow you to do things like look at tables, they open up the SOP, or they move to another form in the series. And you can click on those multiple times during the import. And then these yellow buttons. These are actually not buttons, these are actually labels. So when I click on this label, nothing happens because it's just a label. And all that does is tell you some important information. Like this one says, oh, you can import a spreadsheet file or a text file. Couple things before we start this import that I want to point out. We recommend that when you do an import for the first time, that you allow a 2-hour block of time to do the import. As you get used to using the toolbox, imports usually don't take more than 20 minutes. But we recommend at least having 2 hours of time as you get comfortable with the process, because ideally, you want to finish the whole process. So you want to go through all of the steps, and the steps go from A to M, and you want to complete all of those in one sitting. You don't want to turn off your computer in the middle of it, because then it gets confusing where you left off. So that's what we recommend doing, is doing it all in one process. The other thing I want to point out is that, but we recommend that you import your data after you've entered your QC check data, and we're going to show you why that's the case as we work through this form. So we recommend that every time you do a QC check, you also download your data for import into the toolbox, and that makes sure that your import data is flanked by a QC check on each side. And the one last thing I want to point out, make sure you have your database logbook and your field notes handy when you go through the import process, because we're going to be using the database logbook and probably your field notes quite frequently. Now we're going to go ahead and start the process. So I look at this screen and say, why does it start with the letter B? Where is letter A? That's really confusing. So I'm going to look at the SOP just so I understand what's going on here. So I'm going to open up the SOP. I do that by clicking on the click here for help file button. I'm going to see what it says about step A. So I'm going to scroll up, and here I say step A. Okay, so step A was the import file creation. So that's what we did during module 5. That's what we did outside of the toolbox when we got our file ready for importing into the toolbox. So that's why there's no step A inside the toolbox. We already did that. That's what the help files are for, is if you get really confused on something, open up the help file and take a look at it, because it's step by step. So in the help file, there's an A, there's a B, there's a C, and it goes through each of these steps of importing your data into the toolbox. So now I'm ready to go. So step B, I've got two options. I can do import spreadsheet or import text file. So remember my ozone, I'm going to start with my ozone file. And my ozone file was a text file. So I need to click on the import text file button. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can either click on the little radio button or you can click on the actual button itself. Either one is fine. So when I do that, I get this navigation screen, and I need to tell the toolbox where the file is. So I'm going to go to desktop, because that's where my files are. And I'm going to find my toolbox import files folder. And here is my ozone file. So I click on my ozone file, and I click on open. It doesn't actually open the file, but that's just the way to tell the toolbox that you want to import it. So I click open, and I get this message box that says the import was successful. So I say, okay, good. Thanks for telling me that. And I click okay. And then we move on to the next step in the process. So we move on to step C, and that's taking a look at the data inside of the toolbox. And notice this is a gray button, so we can click on it multiple times. So I'm going to click on Inspect Data Import Table, and that's going to show us that first table in the process. So let's take a look at it and make it big. So let's take a look at the text file first. So the text file, just to refresh our memory, looks like this. So in the toolbox, it doesn't look much different than the actual text file, and that's expected. So the first table in the process is pretty much just putting your data exactly how it was in the text file or the spreadsheet into a table in the toolbox. So one thing that I highly recommend doing is scrolling through the data and making sure there's nothing strange. And by strange, I mean, is there a blank row? Is there some weird characters that shouldn't be in there? So I just scroll through the data and make sure there's nothing strange about it. I'm not seeing anything strange popping out. And then another thing I highly recommend doing is checking that the number of records here on the bottom left corner of the toolbox, making sure that those records match the number of records that are in your import file. So remember, you wrote down everything in your database logbook about this file. So you can look back at your database logbook and say, my database logbook said I had 336 records, and that matches what's in the toolbox. So I am good to go with that. So I'm going to scroll. Well, I can just close this table since I've done everything I wanted to do and inspected everything, and the import looks good to me. So I'll close the table by clicking on the lower X button. If you click on the upper X button, that closes the entire toolbox, and you just have to go back to where you were in the process. It's not a big deal if you accidentally do that. It happens sometimes if you're working really quickly, and it's okay, your data have still been imported. So I click on the lower X to close the screen, and now I'm back in the toolbox form. And I have one option left on this form, and that's continue to transfer to verification table form. So once I click on this button, I'm going to move to the next form in the series. And in that form, I'm going to work on transferring the data from that import table into the next table in the pipeline, and that's the verification table. So once I click on that button, the toolbox closes this form because it tells the toolbox, I am done with this form and I need to go to the next form. So the toolbox closes this form and opens up the next form. So the next step is step D, and that's where we need to pick out the site and sampler. So for my ozone data, my site is S46. So I click on S46, and once I do that, then my sampler ID box is populated. So the sampler ID is my ozone sampler, and mine's really obvious because I named it in an obvious way. That INO3 is my ozone sampler. So I click on that, and then I move on to step E. And step E is set up transfer to data verification. This is probably the most complicated part of this. So we're going to go over it kind of slowly. And why do I need to do this is the question. So we have lots of people that use the toolbox. And like I said, the import table looks exactly like your text file or your spreadsheet file. And it doesn't have specific column names. So one person that uses the toolbox might have their ozone data concentrations in a column that's called concentration 1. And the next person might have their ozone concentration in a column that's called field 1. And the toolbox can't know where your ozone concentration data is in these columns. So you've got to help it out a little bit. You've got to tell the toolbox, where does my concentration data live? And where does my dates live? And where do my times live? So it needs a little help from you in order to get the data out of the import table and into the verification table. So what I call this by short is the field mapping step. And when I say field, that's a database term. Field and column are the same thing. So I say field a lot because I'm a database programmer, but when I say that, I mean column. That's the same thing. So when I click on this set up transfer to data verification table button, let's see what happens. So what happens is that it opens up this query design grid, and it has two panes. So the first pane is this top area here, and this shows your data import table, and it shows the columns in your data import table. And this bottom area here, this is actually specifically called the query design grid. And what you need to do in this little screen is you need to move these columns in data import into this area, which is this blank column query design grid that looks like a table. So there's several ways to do that. And the first way I'm going to demonstrate is just to move all of those columns into this area. So to do that, I'm going to move every single one of these into here. You click on the first column in the data import table, which is the date. And then you click on, well, you hold shift down on your keyboard and you click on the last column, which is the concentration column. So I'm going to hold shift down and then I'm going to click on concentration. And that highlights all of the columns in table data import. And now I can click and drag these columns into this area here. And watch what happens when I do this. So I'm going to click anywhere in this highlighted area, and I'm going to drag into this first blank column. So when I do that, and then I let go of my mouse, the columns spread out. And what we want to pay attention to here is this append to row. So the append to row is how we're going to map these columns to the data verification table. So the toolbox, since these column names are actually the same in my import table and my verification table, the toolbox guesses. So it's smart enough to know that if the names are exactly the same, then those probably go into that column. So it guessed my date and my time. Whenever the toolbox makes a guess like that, make sure you check your import file, because sometimes in your data logger file, time actually includes both the date and the time. So you want to make sure that the date column actually includes just the date, and the time column actually includes just the time. So whenever the toolbox makes a guess, just check to make sure that the guess is correct. So if you go back into your import file, in my case, I've got dates, and it only includes the dates, so that's good, and time, and that only includes the time. So the toolbox did a correct guess in this case, so we're good to go with that. So you'll notice here that the append to row is blank for concentration. So that is where I need to tell the toolbox where to copy the concentration data from my import table to the verification table. So to do that, I click on the row that's in the append to row of the concentration column. And once I do that, I get a drop-down arrow. And on that drop-down arrow, when I click on this, it shows all of the columns in the verification table. So I need to find the concentration column. I'm going to click on that concentration column when I find it. So here's my concentration, and I click on that. And what that does is it tells the toolbox, copy my concentration PPB column from data import into the concentration column in verification table. So that's why it's called field or column mapping. If you just left that blank, then the toolbox wouldn't copy anything into the concentration because you didn't tell it where to copy that. So that's why if you have a column here that you want to transfer over to the verification table, it needs to have a value in the append to row. After you finish mapping all of the fields, and in my case, I only needed to map one field. For your data, you might need to map several fields. It just depends on if your column names line up with the verification table. After I finish mapping all of that, I need to save my query. So I click on this save icon. That looks like a little floppy disk. So I click on that, and then I can close this lower screen by clicking on the lower X button. And now that mapping step is done. The awesome thing about it is that once you map for your particular pollutants, you don't have to do it again. So the next time I import another ozone file into the toolbox and I click on this button, those fields are already going to be saved. So I don't need to do that mapping process again unless something has changed about the format of my ozone files. It seems like a lot of work to begin with, but it's really not that big of a deal because you only have to do it one time unless something changes about the format of your ozone data files. So we're going to move on to step F, and that's transferring the data. So what I've done so far is I've only told the toolbox how to map that data. I haven't transferred the data, so I haven't copied the data from the data import table to the verification table yet. I've just told the toolbox where I want to copy the data. So I need to click on step F to complete that process. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If my data logger collects both dates and times in the same columns, how do I separate them into different columns? Thank you so much for asking that. If your data logger collects both date and time in the same column, that is okay. You do not need to separate those out. There's a field in the verification table that's called date time that you can map to for that. So you don't need to separate those out. Step F, I'm going to transfer the data. So let's go ahead and click on that. And what happens is we get this little message that says, you're about to run an append query. So when you go through these steps, sometimes you're going to get these messages, and you don't need to be scared of them. They're just telling you what the toolbox is doing. So an append query in database terms means it's going to add data to a table. So when you see something about you're about to run a query, just say yes. And that's, once you click on that, the second box is what you need to pay attention to because it tells you the number of records. And you'll always want to make sure that the number of records match what you expected. So remember, in your database logbook, you wrote down the number of records in your file. So you always want to check that 336 matches the number of records in your logbook. And in my case, it does, so I say yes. And now we can move on to step G, which is inspecting the verification table. So let's take a look at our data, and now it's been moved into the data verification table. So here is how the data verification table looks. And you'll notice there's a lot of blank columns, and that's okay, because remember, I mapped only to 3 columns. So I mapped the date and the time and the concentration. So that's what I expect to see, is that only 3 columns are filled in. Here's that date and time column that I was talking about earlier in regards to that question. So the toolbox, as we work through this form, is going to work on filling in these blank columns. So I'm just going to scroll through the data real quick and make sure I don't see anything unusual. So I'm looking pretty good. I don't see any blanks. I don't see any weird characters. We're looking good there. I can close this, and then I can move on to step H, which is update site ID and sampler ID. And when I click on this button, the toolbox is going to start populating some of those blank columns for me. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I get the same thing. So it says you're about to run an update query this time. And an update query means that it's going to change something about your existing data. And that's okay, because that's what I expect it to do. I expect it to add the site ID and sampler ID to my data and do some other dates to my data. So I say yes. And then it tells me the number of rows, which matches what's in my database logbook. So I say yes. And I'm just curious what it did. And remember these gray buttons you can click on multiple times. So I'm just going to take a look. Let's see what the toolbox did. So we can see now that the site ID and sampler ID are filled in, and also filled in some of these other columns in the verification table. So we can close that and move on to the next step, which is step I, and that's view dates and times. So let's take a look at the dates and times. And the most important thing about this is just to make sure that the start date and the start time match what is in your database logbook. So you wrote down the start date and time, and you wrote down the end date and time of your particular file in your database logbook, and you just want to check that the toolbox has that same date and time. So the data are sorted in this particular button. They're sorted by start to end. So when I click on it, at the very top is the start. So that's the time that it started was August 8th at 9 a.m. And then if you scroll to the very bottom, it ended at 8:22 at 8 a.m. So that matches what's in my database logbook, so I'm good to go with that. And I can close this screen by clicking on the lower X. So the next step is step J. And step J is special, and that's why it's peach. It's a peach color button instead of the purple, because chances are you probably don't have to click on it, but you might have to click on it. So it's a conditional button, and that's why it's in set and it's in peach. But sometimes, for some data loggers, they log the end times instead of the start times. What does the end time mean? So if you look at your view dates and times button, let's look at that again, and the start time is 9 o'clock. The toolbox assumes that when it imports a file, that the times in those files are start times. So it assumes that 9 o'clock means that from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, the concentration was 50.9. If that's not the case, if this is actually the end time, so if 9 o'clock really means that the sample was collected from 8 to 9, then you need to run that sampling end time correction. And that's something you should be able to look in your data logger manual, or perhaps if you're not using a data logger, in your analyzer manual, and determine from that if your analyzer or your data logger is logging the start time or the end time. So in my example, I looked at my ozone manual and it said the time that's being logged is the end time. So this is not correct. This is actually the end time and not the start time. So I need to run that correction. So I'm going to close this and I'm going to run this correction. And this is a good thing to write in your logbook if you run this or not. So just so you remember. So I'm going to click on this button in my case to make this correction. And it says, so this step should only be completed if the files you imported are sampling end times. It says start times. Click OK to continue, or click cancel to exit. So if you accidentally click on this button and you don't mean to click on this button, this is your chance to get out by clicking cancel. In my case, I purposely clicked on this button and I want to run the correction, so I'm going to click OK. And once I do that, I get the message box about an update query, so I click yes. And I'm going to update 336 rows, which matches what's in my logbook, so I say yes. And now I want to see what it did. So I'm going to click the view dates and times again. So remember that my 50.9 concentration used to be at 9 o'clock, but it was shifted up to 8 o'clock because that's now the start time. So that's exactly what I wanted, because that was when the concentration started. Was at 8 o'clock, not 9 o'clock. That's what I wanted it to do. So I am good to go with that. And I'm going to write down in my database logbook that I performed this correction. So I can close this screen by clicking on the lower X. Now I can move on. The way to move on is I've got two buttons. I've got to continue to import and qualify pollutant concentrations, and I've got continue to import and qualify meteorological data. I'm currently working with pollutant data, so I'm going to click on the pollutant concentrations button. Now what that is going to do is it's going to close this form, and it's going to open the next form in the series. And in the next form in the series, I'm going to copy my data into the archive table, which is the data's permanent home. So I'm going to go ahead and click on continue to import and qualify pollutant concentrations. The first step on this form is to select the pollutant, which the toolbox already did for me. So I don't need to do that because it looked at my sampler and it knew that this was an ozone sampler. But I need to select my units. In my ozone data, my units are parts per billion. So I select parts per billion, and then I click on the update selected pollutant and units button, and that goes ahead and puts those into my data verification table. So I click on that button, and I get this update, yes, and 336 rows, yes. And step K is done, and then we're going to move on to step L, which is exciting because it's the flagging step. And flagging means that we're going to look at the data and run some checks on it, and if anything is strange about that data, we're going to add a flag to it. And we're not just, when you flag data, you're not invalidating the data. You're just putting a check by it to say, I should look at this later on and make sure that this is actually valid data. So we're not invalidating anything at this point. We're just flagging it for further analysis. And I use qualifying and flagging interchangeably. So sometimes I say qualifying because that's what I was taught in my early days of air monitoring data stuff, is that you should say qualifying. And flagging is the same thing when I say those two words. So this step is actually divided into 3 sub-steps. So we have our first sub-step, which is looking at concentrations and doing some initial checks based on the concentrations. And then we can flag based on QC data. So this is why I said we really recommend that you do QC checks before you import data into Toolbox, so you can flag your data based on any QC checks that were failing. And then we have step L3, which we flag based on external data, like say there was an audit or something like that that needed to flag. You need to flag data based on something, or something that's in your logbook that you want to flag data based on. So we'll start with concentrations. And there's actually 3 different concentration checks you can run with the Toolbox. And the first check is the accepted range check. So you can enter a range into these boxes that you want to check. So by default, the Toolbox uses the minimum value of the MDL. So Melinda showed you this. So when you click here, you can see the method detection limit data. So by default, the Toolbox uses this most common MDL for your particular sample. So in this case, the most common MDL for all of these ozone samplers was 5. Until you set up the Toolbox with your actual AQS sampling method, that's how it does it. Well, in a future module, we're going to show you how to set up the AQS methodology inside of the Toolbox, and then it will go and it will get your actual MDL from the AQS methodology you assign to it. But right now, it's just doing the most common because we haven't set that up yet in the Toolbox. So you can click here and research what the actual MDL is for your particular sampler. And I did that, and mine happens to still be 5, so I don't need to change that. For the maximum, it's always set as 999. And that's something that you probably want to change because it's probably something you want to look at your manual too and see what the absolute maximum is for your particular sampler. Or if you know that you never get concentration values that are above a certain point unless there's an error, maybe you can change that to something more reasonable. I think I'm going to change mine. Let's see what my notes say. I'm going to change mine to 500. So I looked at my manual and it said if anything above 500, it's probably an error. So I'm going to change that to 500. And one thing to notice about this is that when you change it, it doesn't, the Toolbox doesn't save what you changed. So next time, when you import an ozone file into the Toolbox, it's not going to save that number. You just have to always type over it. So maybe that's something you want to know in your database logbook to change the accepted range to something that's more relevant to your data. So now I can display data outside of this concentration range. So what that's going to do is it's going to show me any concentration that's out of this range. So let's click on that button and see what happens. So it shows me that there's 2 concentration values that are below the value of 5. So these are really low, -6999. That is probably some sort of error code. So I definitely want to flag those data. So to tell the Toolbox to flag those data, I go ahead and close this screen by clicking on the lower X. And then I say, can you qualify or flag these data for me? So I click on the next button, and it's telling me, okay, remember that this step is going to qualify the data, but it's not going to exclude the data, so it's not going to invalidate the data. So it's giving me a little warning that you want to make sure to complete the final validation step, and that's in a future module. We're going to go over that to exclude the data from AQS and from future calculations. So I say, okay, I understand. And then it says, you're going to run an update query. Say yes. And it tells me that I'm going to update our flag 2 rows, which is what I expected. And at this point, I'm going to write down in my database logbook that I flagged 2 records that were outside of the range of 5 to 500 parts per billion. I say yes, and that added the flags. So next, the consecutive measurement difference. So what this does is it flags data that vary wildly between one concentration to the next. So you can tell the toolbox how much variance you want here. So by default, it does 3 times the minimum here. So 15 is what it's going to do. So anything where the one value and the next value are more than 15 parts per billion apart, it's going to flag. And this is a little different where we don't get to see the data first. It's just going to go ahead and flag them, but that's okay because it's flagging data. It's not invalidating data. And it's always okay to flag data. So we're going to click on this button. I'm going to leave the default of 15 in this case. Let's see what happens. So it's telling me I'm about to run an update query. I say yes. And it tells me how many rows that it updated. So I write down in my database logbook that the toolbox flagged 18 rows with a consecutive measurement difference of greater than 15 parts per billion. So I say yes. And the next check is duplicate concentrations. So what this does is it adds a flag when there's a duplicate for more than 3 hours. So if the concentration is the same for more than 3 hours, it flags it. And that could be an error in your data. It's common sometimes when you have a tape error in your PM data that something happened and the consecutive measurements are the same. So there's duplicates. So it's got 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3 for many hours. And you know that's a problem. So the toolbox catches that. So let's go ahead and click on that. And again, you don't get to see the data ahead of time, but we're going to go ahead and click on it, and it's going to flag those data for us. In this example, there were no consecutive duplicate concentrations, so it says that 0 records have been flagged. So I say, okay, that's good. And the next flagging we're going to do is based on QC data. So we've done all the concentration checks. Now we're going to move on to QC data. So what happens here is that this shows you the QC checks that you've entered into the toolbox. And the most common QC check is always going to be the one that's on top. And I noticed here that I have a flag, or qualifier, of an LZ1. And that's when my 0 was way higher than it should be. And so now I've got, I fixed it at 850 in my second QC check, but that makes me a little nervous about that data from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So I'd actually like to flag that first concentration check because I'm not sure what happened there. So I'd like to flag that. So the way you can flag based on a failing QC check is you can select the QC check. So I'm going to select that QC check by clicking on it. And then I can look at the QC data. So if I just click on this display button, I can look at the QC data. So this is how the QC data looks. And I can scroll to the right to see my QC check. And I see my 0 check is very, very high here. So I know that this was a little funny. So this one just allows you to look at the QC data. I'm going to close that by clicking on the lower X. And then I want to qualify these data based on these QC checks. So what I want to qualify monitoring data based on this QC check, when I click on this button, I get this little pop-up that allows me to specify the range. So I need to specify the range of data that I want to qualify based on that QC check. So if I click on this first button, it says, here's all the data that's in my verification table. So I just want to flag that first concentration. So just at 8 a.m. is where I want to start flagging, and I want to finish flagging at 8 a.m. because I only want to flag 1 hourly concentration data. And once I click on that last range, it gives me the update query that I'm going to flag that data. So I say yes. And I'm only flagging 1 row, so I say yes. And I write down my database logbook that I flagged 1 row of data due to a failing 0 check. So I say yes. And now that data's been flagged. So the last flagging that's available is based on logbook entries or external audits. I don't have any of that, so there's nothing that I wrote in my logbook that would cause me to flag any additional data. So I'm going to move on to step M, which is transferring the data into its permanent home. So we're going to move the data from the verification table to the archive table where the data is going to permanently live. So the first step is to inspect it in the verification table. And this is how the data look. And if you can see the qualifiers here. So you can see that we've added the qualifiers due to the HD15 was when the concentration varied from 15 parts per billion between one concentration value to the next. And then my level 10. And we can scroll down and look at all of the data and all of the flags. And if you have any questions about what these flags are, in the SOP for final data validation on the last page, it explains what all of these flags are. So there's a little table that says what HD15 means and what R means and all of that. So here's my R, which means out of range, and everything looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and close, clicking on the lower X, and now I can transfer. So I'm going to I confirmed that everything was good, so I'm going to transfer from my verification to my archive table. So I click that button. I'm going to run an append query. So that's good because I'm moving data from one table to the next. So I say yes. And I'm checking 336 matched to my database logbook. I say yes again. And now I get to inspect the data in the archive table. Just when you click on the inspect data in the archive table button, what this is going to show you is the archive table. And when you import multiple files into the toolbox, so down the road, you're going to see all of the data you've ever imported here. So because this is where all the data lives. So when you click on this button, you're always going to see everything you've ever imported into the toolbox. So now, for now, I only have 336 records because I've only imported 1 file so far, but that's going to grow as you work on the toolbox. So I scrolled through the data just to make sure it looks good. Everything looks fine to me. Nothing strange about my data. I always go to the very bottom just to make sure, and then I close that window. Now the next steps in the process are clearing out the pipeline to get ready for your next import into the toolbox. So the first thing you're going to do is clear out the data verification table. So you're going to empty out the data verification table because we've already put it into the archive table. So we need to get ready for our next import. So we clear the data verification table. And it says I'm about to run a delete query. I say yes, that's what I want to do. And I'm going to remove 336 rows. Yes, that matches my database logbook. And then you want to clear out the import table as well. And any of these 3 buttons will do it. It just depends on if you want to continue with another import, or if you just want to close the toolbox for now. You've done 1 import, you're done. So I want to enter data from a different file because I want to move on and do my PM 2.5 file as well. So I'm going to click on this bottom data that says enter metadata or other pollutant concentration from a different import file button. So what that's going to do is it's going to clear out my import table. It's going to open up the form where I can work from my PM 2.5 data file button. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it's going to say this step will delete the data import table. So I say, okay, that's what I want to do. I've already archived that data. So I click OK on that. And that takes me back to the data import form where I can work on my PM 2.5 data.